Hello. This is my second time to Liverpool, and I'm very happy to be back, so thanks for coming. What I'm going to talk about is basically my career. Ian mentioned the Olympics. I want to really go into that with some depth because I think it was really one of my early projects that really kind of set up the rest of my design career. So, if you look at the spiral here, it's kind of generates from the beginning, from the central part out, and it's a chronological kind of record of my work through icons. And if you look at that last one is the Olympics. So I didn't have that much experience. I had very good experience, but I was only 29 when I did the Olympics, so I wasn't out of school that long. I've done a lot of work since the Olympics, so you can see how it influenced a lot. And when I say it influenced, it did influence a lot of my work after the Olympic Games. Now, a little bit of my background. I'll talk about design a lot, but I want to talk also about things that I've experienced as a person, like we all are. We have a lot of experiences with work outside of design. We have a lot of experiences with family and so forth. I live in Manhattan now, the Central Circle. And if you're familiar with Manhattan, we live on West 80th Street. It's just behind the Museum of Natural History. And I studied industrial design in Brooklyn. And then if you look over to the left, I grew up in Kearny. Now Kearny's an interesting place because when soccer football came to the United States, it came to the United States and South America probably around the same time through the Scottish factory workers, initially to Kearny anyway. So I kind of grew up with football, and I really appreciate it. Now, I mentioned family. My grandfather was an engineer on the railroad, and my family really was a working family. He was son of a man that worked in the coal mines over in Pennsylvania, and he actually became a worker on the railroad and got out of that. And he was the first guy really the first person that brought me into the city where I saw New York. And once I did that, I wanted to come to New York. But he also had a lot of stories when I was a little kid. Here I am about 4 or 5 years old, and he was in the Spanish-American War. And after that, he went out west in the United States, and he was out in New Mexico. And I got a lot of those stories. He was actually out there. That's him. He was out there when Billy the Kid was out in New Mexico, and he actually met Pat Garrett, the guy that supposedly shot Billy the Kid. So I got a lot of cowboy stories. I didn't know what graphic design was then, but I certainly wanted to be a cowboy. I was the kid in class that could draw in grade school. I imagine a lot of you were also. And my father had he was a fisherman. He ran a boat off the coast of New Jersey, so I spent a lot of young years out on the Atlantic. And any of you that are familiar with the sea, there's a certain kind of aesthetic that comes out of that kind of environment. It's kind of a no-nonsense aesthetic, and I think that really influenced my work. I did a lot of work in factories. At that time, I could work, summers in the factory. I could work 7 days a week, sometimes 12, sometimes 10 hours a night, but I can make enough money to pay a whole college tuition. I don't think you can do that anymore so easily. So that was good. Also, the factory workers. I really respect the factory as far as an environment that I got a lot out of. And some of those people that work in the factories, they're like the Messies of that kind of endeavor. They were really, really good at what they did. So I appreciate that with them too. I think the first time I saw graphic design was with the Los Angeles Rams and the way they had the ram on their helmet. So I really liked the Los Angeles Rams when I was a kid, and I particularly liked their quarterback, Bob Waterfield. Now I knew that Bob Waterfield was married to Jane Russell, so I had an idea of how to get an autograph from Bob Waterfield. There's Jane. I drew a picture of Jane and sent it to her and said, I'd love to have your autograph and an autograph of your husband, Bob Waterfield. They were married. So I got a letter. I was still in high school, and it said, Dear Lance, thank you so much for the sketch. Your work shows definite promise. Keep up the good work. Now, I didn't expect that, and that was kind of one of those reinforcements along the way where I thought, wow, my drawing might not be that bad. So it was a little kind of kick in the butt to make me pay attention to that part. It wasn't easy growing up in an industrial town, being the guy that could draw. I had to get into sports, and I did get into sports. I boxed when I was like, 14, 15, and I was pretty good actually. I was in a boys' club, and I had about 4 fights. And actually, it was a young guy my age came over from London, Butch Whitten, I still remember him, and I discovered what a counterpunch was through Butch, but it was Butch's counterpunch. So I never knew what hit me. I got hit, and I was on the seat of my pants, and I figured that's not a good idea to keep this up. I got into sports. I wasn't really that good in sports, but I was good at getting into understanding the different sports. And I had a good game. We won a championship in basketball, and I had 18 points, which really was a good endeavor for me. Played football, American football, learned how to get knocked down. Now I was fairly popular when I was in high school, and I ran for class president, and this was actually my poster. I made this poster and won the election. Had no idea what I was getting into, but I won the election. And my family was still fairly poor, and I had no plans to go to college, but being class president and then being interviewed in the class in the school newspaper, everyone else was going to college. When it got to me, I said, well, I'll do something with my art. And when I saw it printed, I thought, that's not a bad idea. But that's about all the planning I had. I wound up going to Pratt, and this was really a good experience. I couldn't study graphic design because they didn't really teach it in the States at that point. So I studied industrial design. They taught graphic design at a graduate level, but undergraduate, I had to pick something else. They had illustration, fine arts, industrial design, and I think advertising was the 4th one. So I chose industrial design. Now, in my 3rd year, it was a 4-year course, I was chosen to represent the school and by General Motors, and this was their new tech center out in Warren, Michigan. So I worked there for a summer. Now this was really an incredible experience. That's part of the group that was there, and it was from all over the country, and they had chosen design students from all over the country to come together. And they had a graphic design course. So I did the industrial design course, which I went out for, but I also did the graphic design course. I met a student from Yale who studied with Paul Rand. I was hired back after that summer program and after I graduated from Pratt, and I was hired back to develop packaging and a logo for Delco, and I designed the Delco logo for parts. This is all the General Motors parts. And you can see the logo there and the early concepts for the packaging, and it was 1,200 different designs, 1,200 different packages. So this is where my industrial design training really came in handy, the understanding of systems, because this was a system that I had at the point when we were putting the manual together, I got my draft notice. They were still drafting, and I had to wind up doing military service. And I had no idea that this would be useful as a design background, but it gave me a lot of working on maps. So this was very helpful for things that I'd be doing later. After that, I didn't want to go back to General Motors. I didn't really like being involved with a large corporation. It was a bit sterile in a lot of ways, although I had a great experience working there. There weren't many jobs in New York at that time, so I wound up staying in Detroit, Michigan, working with a small office, and they had a contract to do an exhibit for the Department of Commerce, for the United States Department of Commerce. So I wound up getting the graphics for that, and wound up going to Zagreb, Yugoslavia. I lived in Zagreb for 3 months in the installation and construction of a lot of the exhibit. So the idea of the show was constructive use of leisure time. So I developed an hourglass with the sun and moon, the hourglass being time and the sun and the moon being daytime, nighttime activity. Now, all the background I had up to that point, especially with the industrial design training, I suggested, why don't we do this in the 3rd dimension? make an entrance at it. And we did. I mean, this is probably the biggest thing I've ever done, and it was one of the first jobs I ever had. And it was really the introduction to me that, you know, you could take visual ideas and very easily manifest them in the third dimension. This is very early in my career, but very helpful for the rest of my career. And we made a fence by vacuum forming the hourglass. I came back to New York after that and got a job with George Nelson. Now, George Nelson was one of the best offices probably in the world at that point. So that was a real honor to get a position with him. And it was to do the graphics for the Chrysler World's Fair. Now, the Chrysler World's Fair had 5 islands, and it was for children, and it was on the construction and all of what goes on in making and selling cars. So, and it was for children. So I developed an element that was a pointing hand, and it was developed to be a pin that we gave to the kids, a VIP pin, very important person. And this was very effective because it got the branding, if you will, of that pavilion all over the World's Fair site. So when these kids were in other places, you were aware that Chrysler was around. And also, the idea of having 5 islands, I had to develop some way of getting you from one place to another if you wanted to find the different things. So that was a model, and here's the graphics that we did. We did illustrations on the hands, pointing to the different areas of the site. Now, my factory working experience really came in handy here in a strange way. I thought, you know, if kids are going to be put on a factory, you know, a simulated factory production ride, why not give them more experience of seeing what goes on in a factory? So I developed a series of safety posters. And the idea was to take this little factory guy and kind of put him through all the stuff that you had to pay attention to in the factory. Howard Miller Clock Company, which was one of George's clients, decided to make a poster collection out of these that they actually sold to factories. And DuPont used them in all their factories, and I think other companies did too. So it was kind of a full circle coming from factory to design back into the factories. I came over on vacation to London, and actually I visited the brother of a fellow I was working with at the Nelson office, and they both were Royal College students. One graduated, the other was still at the Royal College. So I went to the Royal College and met the brother, and in the process met Peter Murdoch at a party there. And Peter was studying furniture design, so when he found out that I was working for George Nelson, who was very involved with Herman Miller Furniture, Peter and I became good buddies, and he had won the scholarship there to do anything in his, after he graduated for 1 year that he wanted to do, and he wanted to come to New York. So it was really just perfect that I was there at the same time that he was looking to come to New York. So he came to New York and he developed this paper chair, which is now famous Spotty chair. We were working together while I was at the George Nelson office. And it was during that period. Now, this is a kind of a transitional period, but basically the way it happened, I was doing the graphics for the World's Fair in New York. Peter and I were working outside of the Nelson office, and we were going to start our own office. I had met an architect who had worked on the Mexican pavilion and then came over after the World's Fair and worked with the Nelson office, where I was still working after the fair. It was through him that Peter and I found out about a competition in Mexico to do the graphics. So we got on the list. It was for individual designers to come down for a 2-week period, and if something happened, to do the graphics, great, and if it didn't, you went back home. Well, we had one-way tickets, and I had just met my wife at that point, who's here tonight, Neela, and she had just come back from the Peace Corps, and we were married before the opportunity to come down to Mexico. This was in May. We found out about Mexico. Neela and I met in May. We got married in September, and we all came down to Mexico in the end of that year, 1966. So that's me on the left, Neela in the center, and that's Peter on the right. This is actually our first day in Mexico City. Now, the deal was we had 2 weeks to come up with something. We had to do something that had nothing to do with a Mexican sitting under a cactus with his hat down. They didn't want any of that. They wanted no tequila. And they wanted something contemporary. They wanted something that had to deal with the fact that we had to use 3 languages, Spanish, French, and English, if we did anything that had to do with language. And then the other thing is we had to work with the 5 rings. So, and we had no computers. I mean, at that point, everything was freehand, or because I was an industrial designer, I did use drawing instruments quite easily. So I still keep my drawing instruments. And the 5 rings, I found that I could develop the year 68, around the geometry of the 5 rings. So this is really the first, I call it a compass sketch, but it was really the first getting into the geometry of the rings and utilizing that. So basically that's how the whole thing started. And thank God this happened right at the end of the 2 weeks, because we had one-way tickets going to Mexico, so we were in trouble if nothing happened. So this happened, and it was like a magical experience to have something that all of a sudden people came into our little office and wanted copies of it. From the 68, I was able to develop the typography Mexico 68. At first, I didn't like it because I couldn't separate the numbers in the 68, but then I realized that it was really a ligature face, and anything that we did had to be a ligature or it didn't look right. So, and that's why this face never really has been used properly, because it is a ligature invention, so to speak. Now, at that time, Bridget Riley and Op Artists had a big show in New York, Op Art. So I had seen that before going to Mexico, and that really gave me a lot of excitement about getting energy, getting movement out of the flat surface. So it was a natural to, in a contemporary way, start exploring with the Mexico 68. And this became the official poster for the games. Now, the other thing, it didn't start with Op Art for me. I spent a lot of time at the Museum of Anthropology and really discovered some of the early cultures in Mexico. And some of these people were really the best artists, designers, you know, historically, any place, I think. And they used a lot of lineal structures. And even today, in the popular art, this is an example of a Huichol painting on board with wool. And we actually, well, here I can show you what the process is. They would work with their own motifs, of course. This is some type of a mythological bird. But we had 2 of the Huichol Indians come down to the Museum of Anthropology, and we gave them a board with the 68 screened on it. And then what they would do is cover it with wax, and this is how they traditionally did their wool paintings. They'd cover it with wax and then lay wool in it. Now, the idea of doing this was to just let them do what they wanted to do with this. And the thing that was very valuable that came out of this is that we had a chance to see them be expressive with their color, and it was really a lesson in color, which was very important because we could take the 68, and by not changing at all the structure, the physical structure, just change the color, and really have a tool that we keep the branding intact, but we also had a tool that could make us also give a sense of place, a sense of Mexico. So in the foreground, you can see a lot of publications. Every week we changed the color of the Mexico 68, but we didn't lose the hard line branding of the Mexico 68, but through color, we made it look more like Mexico. And the radiating lines were really a lifesaver in so many ways. I had to do a series of stamps for the opening of the games where all of the different subject matters had nothing to do with sports in many cases. And just by finding a way of radiating within that subject matter, I was able to create a series of stamps that, again, looked like they were part of the Olympics. Now, this is postage stamp application, but we also took the geometry and applied it in a very large scale in many instances. So, I mean, these were beautiful when you flew into Mexico City and you saw the different stadiums with the radiating patterns on the plazas. It was a very, very nice sight driving in, or flying in. The black and white was very important, just by letting it radiate. I showed you how the poster was designed. Now this was before any kind of technology to image large. You can see the lines here. They actually painted these around Mexico City. And this is very difficult because if you make any variation of line, you see it right away. And they were very careful to keep it pretty consistent. We used the pattern on uniforms. I worked with Peter's wife, Julia Murdoch, very closely in designing all of the uniforms. And when you saw the parallel line, the motif, you knew it was part of the Olympics. So the branding really had a way of getting out there in a very strong way. One of the things that I enjoyed working on, and I think it's one of the more successful, public applications of the Mexico 68 radiating. And here I worked with Eduardo Terrazas. He was the Mexican who came and worked with George Nelson in New York. So Eduardo was very involved in the program for the Olympics. And we worked on this, and you can see the model I just showed you, but then you can see also here the entrance. This is the Milan Triennale, and it was the Mexican pavilion, and Mexico chose an Olympic theme, so they asked the Olympic Committee to do the pavilion. Now, I showed you the basic typographic and patterning that was really important for the branding. There were other things that were important too, like identifying all of the sports. And we did this in a different way. We had a nice model in 1964 as far as an overall graphics program was concerned. Tokyo did a great job. They used a stick figure to represent the different sports. And we wanted to do something that was more synonymous with some of the cultural things from Mexico. Before Peter and I went, some of the students that were working on the program had already started doing this, taking this approach to developing the icons for the sports. And it was a good one, and we continued that. And it was a process of focusing on a part of the athlete's body and or a piece of equipment. So this would be track and field. When in the water events, water became part of the icon itself. Now I mentioned keeping it more in touch with the culture of Mexico. These are Mayan glyphs, and you can see that kind of rounded square form that happened quite a bit. So that was really the idea of the background shape for all of the sporting events. Now, I mentioned earlier we had to use 3 languages, and we tried not to use any of the 3 languages if we could possibly get away with it. And we did get away with it in quite a few areas. For example, on the signs, we didn't use anything that said basketball or rowing. We just put the symbols up, and you had all of this repeated on your tickets and so forth, so you could find it. Now, not so much for the Olympics, but at that period in history, this is 67, 68, I did a lot of work with iconography. I really fell in love with the communication quality of iconography, but people outside of the Olympics looked at this as being for illiterates, and you might think that's funny, but that was not something that was easy to deal with as far as taking it outside of the Olympics and doing it for other programs, and I'll show you examples for the city itself. But now we all take iconography for granted. I mean, everyone navigates their electronics with icons, and we take it for granted, and it's one of those wonderful things that does cross language barriers quite easily. One of the things that we developed along with the sporting icons was the cultural event. We had one cultural event for each sporting event. So we didn't have a program really, but I developed icons for one icon for each event, and then we sent out programs to invite participation between to all of the nations that were participating in the sporting events. And it wound up being a very, very lovely program. And the icons were really the very beginning of making that happen. One of the icons was for a program of peace, and at that period, all of the billboards in Mexico City had a theme of peace, and they used the icon from the Olympics. We use the icons for many things as part of the Olympics. Again, working with Julia Murdoch, this is jewelry using all of the different icons, this one being the peace icon. Well, peace wasn't really the only thing that was happening in Mexico at that point. In a lot of places, Martin Luther King was assassinated in the States. Mexico was the first nation to issue a stamp for Dr. King, and they asked me to design it, so that was a real honor. I sent my fee to Mrs. King, Coretta King, and I got a really nice letter back from her, thanking me and my nation. And I was kind of pissed at the States because they didn't issue a stamp, so I never told her I wasn't American. I mean, I wasn't a Mexican, I was American. I found out later that they didn't issue a stamp except for presidents. They didn't issue stamps for anyone else that had a memorial coming up, except for presidents. 10 years you had to wait if you weren't president, so I relaxed a little bit on that one. Now, the other thing that was happening at that time, they had a student revolution, and it was a very serious one. About 500 students were killed just before the Olympic Games started, and they used a lot of my graphics to do anti-government posters and things. You can see the stamps, the icons, and so forth. And this was an interesting experience personally. I knew more about it because of Neela, who was home. I was at the Olympic Committee and was out, kind of on the outskirts of the city, so we were really working our tails off trying to get stuff done for the Olympics. So we didn't realize the gravity, how bad things were going as far as the students were concerned. And I remember Neela saying, I saw tanks in the street once when I came home from the Olympic Committee. So then you start realizing this thing is getting more and more serious. And it was serious. And they as I mentioned, they killed 500 or more students. And one of the things that happened for me is that I felt a little torn. You can't really do anything about something like this, especially being an American in Mexico. But I always felt, I called it feeling a little dirty. I was working for the Olympic Committee. I did not want the Olympics to be stopped by the student, uprising, but I did not want the government out killing students either. So it was a bit of a, funny situation that way. In 1986, I gave a talk at the University of Mexico, and the rector of the school gave me this book, and he apologized for not being able to have it printed until 1986. That's quite a bit after '68. And he said he wanted to thank me personally for developing a language, a visual language, that he could use as one of the students who did the anti-government posters. So, and I lost it. I really lost it. I got very emotional. I couldn't talk. So that was really one of those things that you can't make up. I mean, it's just amazing, that experience. And now it's come full circle because just last year, Mexico asked me to develop a memorial logo for the memorial of Tlatelolco. Now, Tlatelolco is the place where all the students were killed, most of them. So I took the Mexico 68 typeface and did Memorial 68, and then made a phoenix out of the dove and brought them out of the 68. So they're using this. Now, I want to talk about other things design-wise, and I think, if you could say I have a focus of what I'm talking about now, I'm talking about visual communication, but in a very simple way, and how to use it in a more complicated strategy of developing a system. And I think any of you that are interested in not just branding, I call it urban image now, and part of urban image is wayfinding, where you're developing a program that includes maps, it includes signage, it includes branding, it includes all those things that make you understand and feel more comfortable in many ways about understanding history and other things about your own city, and it's very helpful for people that visit the city. So the Greeks used the silhouette to indicate a lot of the sporting events in the early games. I used silhouettes, but I used them on a postage stamp, one postage stamp for each of the 19 games. But what I did was update the silhouette, and then make the stamp so that if you put one stamp next to itself, you get motion. So I did the whole series of stamps, 19 stamps. The stamps themselves became part of the Olympic branding. And another Apple. Neil and I were driving down the West Side Highway in a cab, and I saw the billboards. This was in 2004, and I saw the iPod billboards, and I thought I had a deja vu experience. I thought I was seeing stamps, but anyway. So we used the silhouettes in a way that was very functional. The entrance to a stadium, the stairs or ramps going into the particular area of the stadium, the seating groups, or the sections, the particular rows, and particular seats. So if you look at a ticket, and all the tickets had this same technical way of getting into your seat. Now, starting with, I mentioned that we didn't use any language. Well, we did use proper names, and we used them in the typography from the Mexico 68. So Estadio 68 is what the stadium was called. I mentioned that we didn't use anything to identify the sporting events except the icons. This would be a track and field event on October 14. All the October 14 tickets would be olive green. The blue stripe gives you where you find your particular seating area, or your entrance, your seating area, and your particular seat. So, and then this would be echoed on the signs. It's a very simple system, and you realize that an Olympics has a very multilingual audience. And we had no complaints. So I know this type of very simple approach graphically can work. So if you had a seat in entrance 13 in the blue section, you'd have a sign that had a blue area indicator, entrance 13, and then you'd go from there to your row of seats and to your seat. So that was a big lesson from the Olympics. I had a lot of experience developing a graphic way, if you will, of putting information out in the street, putting information into publications and so forth, kind of keeping the graphics as pure as possible to avoid all the languages, well, there are three, but to avoid those three and to help all the other languages kind of navigate. Now, after the Olympic Games, we stayed on in Mexico, and had a chance to develop the identity for the metro, the underground. And it was called the Metro, and these are early sketches in looking for a logo for the Metro. Ultimately, it was a focus on the square. The square in both pre-Columbian times and when the Europeans came, Spanish specifically, the Zocalo is the center of the city, the square. So I took the Zocalo, cut into it the three lines of the M and the three lines which were going to be the inauguration of the Metro. And by cutting off that upper right-hand corner, developed the mark for the Metro. From that geometry, I developed a complete typography. I wanted to develop a typography that was more compatible with lineal application that was very much part of the stations and so forth of the Metro, and I'll show you one example of that. The color of the trains are orange. We used orange to identify the entire system. Now here's where the iconography became problematic as far as convincing them that they should use an icon to identify every station. They said, we don't want to be looking like a city that's a bunch of illiterates and we need icons. And I said, no. And so I mean, there was a little talking that had to happen here, and I was convinced enough that it was part of it. Yes, if you're illiterate, it's going to help you. But if you're from China and come to Mexico, and you can't even read Roman letters or Arabic numbers, you know, you're going to have a problem. But if you could tell your friend to meet you at the duck station in Chinese, there you go. You have a better shot at finding your way around the Metro. And it works. And you can see here, the icons with that rounded corner of the Metro M have a unique shape, and I'll show you how that works. But you can see that each one of these photos have something to do with the area that the station is in. So it's not just being pictorial, it's being pictorial with content. And it's very interesting because you dig up a lot of history from the city that's meaningful, and people that live there don't know some of these things. So that was it. That was the beginning, and these are symbols, icons for the first line of the metro. And here, when I was mentioning the upper rounded corner, you can put them very close together, and you get a very visual line of the metro. And when you take that line and put it over the door in the car, and if you wanted to go to the Cannon station, Balderas, the Cannon, you just waited until you got to the station with the Cannon as the icon if you didn't want to remember Balderas. Now this was taken last year, so I mean these things are like still happening as information, and they work very well. Our daughter was born in that year when I did the metro, and these are my two assistants, Pancho and Arturo, and this is the way we worked. I showed you line 1, we were working on line 2 and 3, and we did our research, we put sketches up, we had people check it out to see if it made any sense, and little by little by little, that was the process of putting the whole thing together. So we developed the lines 1, 2, and 3. Now the metro has 12 lines, and the rest of the symbols were designed by Mexican designers, and it's still alive and still working. And at the moment, I'm working on things in Mexico City, and I hope to revise some of the things that don't work as well and keep the system going in a citywide way for other modes of transportation. One of the things that this is the type of thing that I really enjoy with this type of work. I showed you the Olympics, the students, how they use things. There was a big, problem in Mexico for residents in one of the areas of Mexico where a developer was going to build something that was going to wipe out a lot of the neighborhoods. So they had this kind of big campaign, and they used 5 or 4 of the metro symbols to indicate the neighborhoods that were going to be destroyed. But they relate to the metro symbols as representing their neighborhoods. And that's really nice, and I've had that experience in other projects, and for me that's as much reward as you can have for your work. I came back to New York in 1971. We had our daughter now. Neil and I moved back to the city in 1971, and one of the first projects we got, I went into partnership with Bill Cannon, who at that point was a vice president of George Nelson in office, and Bill joined me, and we had an office together for about 9 years, and we had some very important projects. One of the first ones was the mapping for the Washington Metro. Part of that was we did all the neighborhood maps, and we did the system diagram. Basically, it's based on the London Underground as far as the lineal aspect of it is concerned. I got a bit more graphic here in the downtown area. Now this is a redo. This is in 2013, and we did the original one in 1976, so a few years later. And the reason for this is that they brought a new line in from, excuse me a minute, I'm just going to get a little water here so I don't dry up and blow away. So you can see that gray line coming in up from the northwest. So they had to redo the line, or redo the whole map. So they asked me to come back. I was no longer working with Bill. They asked me to come back and not redesign. It was a redesign though, because there was a lot of changes that had to be made. And I won't go into that in detail, but the one thing that happened, this is a front page of the Washington Post. It's the top section, then all the news, and I was down at the bottom of the front page, and they had a fairly elaborate article on the Metro map redesign. And I just am very happy when design gets into a general public type of publication, or we talk to ourselves a lot, but it's also good to get out there and be able to have interviews and to talk to people that aren't designers, so they realize that design can be an important part of their community. Corporations know this, but I think there's a lot of people that don't know that design can participate. Now, I want to talk a little bit about technical things that might be, I hope, are helpful for you guys. One of the things that I learned in doing a lot of work for urban environments, pretty much what the engineers learned when they were doing road signs in the early beginnings of doing road signs, that the background shape can play an important role. So these are different background shapes. Now I mentioned the Mayan glyphs or glyph systems in Mexico being the background shape of the sporting symbols. The cultural program was a process of letting the 68 radiate out to a certain point, and that became the background shape. And what this does, it kind of gives you a context, a visual context, so it all looks like it's part of one program. And it gives you a chance of having a lot of different things as far as subject matter and getting it all working together. The Metro M has that rounded corner. Now this is kind of weird, but it's true. Thomas Jefferson, one of the early Americans, was an architect. He did Monticello. And he did a nice thing, I thought, with a sphere, and he just dropped the sides down, and that's how he did the dome of Monticello. So I flattened that, turned it over, and I made banner shape out of that for all the mall icons in Washington. And Trenton, on the Potomac River, you have water. The river, so I gave it a water edge. Central de Abasto in Mexico City, the A radiating out into a soft A form. And then New Mexico. The pyramid shape is synonymous with New Mexico, and this is for the city of Albuquerque, where some of the petroglyphs have the pyramid shape. So if that's helpful, I hope it is. And then a couple of the last things. Let me get a cough drop here. I'm going to not be able to talk, so we'll have a little pause. This is one of my favorite programs. It's the Minnesota Zoo. And these are early studies. This is before computer also, so this is pretty much how I worked all the way up to the point of having computer. Now this is a combination. Now I want to show this because it takes two known things. The moose and the letter M, and it's a synthesis of two forms. And I use this when I can because it's an easy way to get, an easier way to get a uniqueness by combining two things. So this is the Minnesota moose. I developed typography based on the moose. And used the synthesis technique for all of the trails of the zoo. So you had a sense of the inhabitants on the trail, or the important inhabitant on each trail, and the numbering system. Of course, you can remember things easier. Developed an arrow, called it the guide bird, using the same technique. Maps, guide bird, and icons. All the road signs. It's cold in Minnesota. Very cold. And again, this was chosen by Time magazine as one of the best designs in the United States, one of the 10 best designs in the United States in 1981. So that was great. I recently had a show in Mexico. I called it Urban Icons, and this is a poster I did for that. It was at a lovely new installation, contemporary arts museum, art and design, called MUAC, M-U-A-C, at the University of Mexico. And you can see a lot of it was very physical. They rebuilt a lot of the things that, well, some of the things that you've seen here, and a lot of the other things that were done in a similar type of way. They did a very nice book on 11 major Mexican projects. And I showed you Pancho and Arturo. This was a very magical experience because this was back in 1969, and the MUAC exhibition was last year. And here's Pancho and Arturo. They're still in Mexico, so it was really, really lovely to meet up with them again. They were really my two close assistants for that program. And that's the baby that was born, our daughter. Now she has her own baby, so we have a granddaughter. And this was at the exhibit in MUAC. Now, I mentioned football before, and the bird, this was during the Olympics. We were in the stadium in 1970 when Brazil and Pelé and Carlos Alberto and all those guys played Italy for the World Cup, and that was a great experience. And I did the mascot for Mexico, and they have an eagle, that's their bird. So I had them born out of the ball. And I didn't design this, but I designed Pico. But all down the main drag of Mexico City, when they have a special event, they put lights up. So I was very proud of Pico to be made into the lights. Now, this was originated here, and it was a 64-32-16, where each country was designated a designer, and you had 90 minutes after a match in the World Cup to do a poster. So I was the U.S. designer, and we were in a really tough 16. Our first match was against Ghana, and we won. So that was a really good start. We played Portugal second. We tied them, which was good. We played Germany. We only lost 1-0, which was great, but we both got out of the 16. So we advanced with Germany. We didn't go quite as far as Germany. In fact, we played Belgium next. So that was it. So I had my 4 posters. But this was such a nice experience to do a poster in 90 minutes and get it up on the web. So it's a really good exercise. I showed you my first presidential poster. I got better at that. I did one of Obama's official posters in 2008. Just had in Sheffield, had a really lovely exhibit. This is just a few days ago. And that's the old Chrysler hand. And you can see in the foreground, they had all my sketchbooks. And it was really a real joy for me to see some of this stuff I haven't looked at for years and years and years, and all of a sudden it's all out there. Quite nice. If you have a chance to see it, just as a good exhibit, not just because it's my work, but it was a really nice overview. And of course, unit editions. Adrian Shaughnessy and Tony Brook did a beautiful job on my book. I'm very, very happy with that, and very indebted to them for just putting so much time and effort and doing such a beautiful job. And I'm still at it. I'm still designing. So that's it. Thank you. I guess we can have some questions, yeah? I got my voice back.
Okay, would anyone like to ask an answer question? Karina.
Hello? Sorry. I have a rather ethical question. When we are judged for doing a creative piece of work, in order to make it real, we put a part of ourselves in it. We try to empathize with the subject. But when we reach a point where we're judged to do what we are trying to make, we can in no way relate to, and it's not something that we ourselves would want to make or would want to believe in. How do we proceed into creating that something and making it an actual, honest piece of work?
Wow. Well, I think, let's go right back to the beginning. I think try to do the work that you like doing and try to do the things that ethically make sense for you to be doing. And that's a very individual type of thing. I mean, I'm not going to tell you to be a moral person or something, but I think I can tell you some stories related to that. Let's see. I had mentioned here that, try to talk to people that are outside of your own profession. I think this story would relate to anybody. This happened in Harlem. When Neil and I came back to New York, we renovated a building. This is a long story, but I think it's a good one because it's. I'll tell you two stories, in fact. We came back to New York, and we renovated a building that was all boarded up and everything, and it was at that time, it was a very, very tough part of Manhattan. There were a lot of drugs, a lot of things that went on. Neela was in the Peace Corps, so she got very involved with the neighborhood. And now it's one of the best neighborhoods because a lot of people have made efforts to make these buildings work and everything. So, okay, that's part of it. But in the process, she dragged me around to a lot of community groups so I could talk to them. And I think the purpose there was good because in their communities, they had designers that could do things like T-shirts and banners and logos and things that would help the community itself. So that was my mission, to talk to them and talk about their possibility of having these people help them. And there was a group uptown. It was Harlem or the Bronx, but it was in the basement of a church, and there were about 40 women, let's say, and they were all in their 50s, 60s, so you could see when something got done. These were the guys that did it. So I started talking to them about design. And I got about 4 slides into how great design was, and a woman about as close as the front row here stood up and says, "What the fuck are you talking about, man?" You know? So, I mean, that was an epiphany experience because it made me realize that, you got to be talking in a language that someone understands. And so I didn't lose it. I looked at her and said, "Well, do you have a T-shirt? Does your block association have a T-shirt?" She said, "No." And I said, "Why?" And I had her, at least we had a dialogue going a little bit. So I asked her if I could start again. So I started again. I ran through about, 50, 60 slides. Didn't mention design, just talked about what they could accomplish if they did this, or this, And at the end, I got applause, and she was applauding. I looked that way, so that was a good experience. So I don't know whether that helps you, but I think getting involved in something outside of being all knotted up just by what you do and what your profession is, whether you be an artist or a designer, I think open up, and it'll answer that question for you a little bit better because you'll show up in a different way. You won't be just thinking art or design. You'll be thinking maybe even community or. And I think that kind of answers the ethical part a little bit. So it's an opening up process that I think would be very helpful. And you can answer that question yourself. Okay? Yep.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for a fantastic and very thoughtful presentation. I'm very curious about the story behind the icons for the Cultural Olympiad in Mexico in 1968.
Uh-huh.
these icons being developed. Now, you mentioned how with the sports icons, obviously you had the sports and you reflected on the bodies or the technologies around them. In the case of culture, I have done the work around this, so I know the different icons. What is very curious is the choice of things like outer space,
Mhm.
not just the opposite. How did that happen? And how much was that the result of interacting with the different colleagues there in Mexico?
Yeah.
Or a bit of random processes of pushing the idea of culture beyond the typical lines?
That was a very simple process. I was part of it, but I wasn't the one who said you should have science or whatever. But I was part of that very early, thinking about that. And it was just a very simple process of realizing that we had 19 sporting events and just put on the table 19 events that could be cultural. And it was really a marvelous program. When you start thinking about that, you could probably do it yourself. Children's painting, well, that's good, ballet, But as soon as you start getting into scientific culture, then it becomes a much more richer. We had Jerry Mulligan came down. We had music programs. It was great, But that's how it started. It was just sitting around the table and collaborating. And I don't remember coming up with any ideas for the culture, but I did come up with a lot of ideas for what they could be represented. But the fact that series of icons, when it was sent out, inspired people to want to participate, because they could see you could get a sense and a feeling of the program. And I think that's what icon systems do. We all know that now because of, our apps and all of these things that are being developed. We're going to be developing a lot of things. We have no idea where we're going with this stuff, but we have a lot to learn, and it really is a good method to cross over the written, the spoken language. And I don't think we started communicating with words and spoken language, maybe spoken, but maybe not words, as far as the abstraction goes, as far as the language itself. We're probably more direct in a lot of ways. But anyway, that's for someone else to figure out.
Hello. I was just wondering, it's probably a silly question, but anyway, how in the shift between working on paper and working on computers, whether you feel like your thought process has changed. So I've had people talk about, say film editors have talked about how by moving from working on flatbed and having to sort of physically edit the film,
Yeah.
and then say editing it digitally, when they were working on film, they had to think for longer and they had to be more careful with the sort of the decisions that they were making, because obviously it was the only copy of the film they had.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear about people who worked in analog processes, that when they had to do that, when they had to physically draw something, it gave them longer to think about the thing that they were doing. Whereas obviously in digital it's more instantaneous, so they can work, their workflow is different. And I was wondering if that changed the thought process and what you were working on.
Mm-hmm. Some of it I understand, some of it I don't. Not your question, the process though. And one of the things that I often question, I've done a lot of iconography, and refined iconography isn't a lot. In fact, it's exactly the same as refined typography. You have a lot of visual adjustments to make things look the way you want them to look. Make a straight line look straight. Sometimes you get things that make it visually look concave, or And I know all the tricks working with my hands, with compasses, with different types of films and so forth, different types of instruments, and I know how I got to the final form. Now, on the computer, I'm not so sure I would just as easily get to that final form. I might not even be aware of it. I'm not sure. I think there is a difference in the quality, but being so close to it, I'm not sure. But I certainly know that when I digitized all of my work that was done by hand, I knew how to do all of those very subtle adjustments in the computer. But if I started out designing on the computer, I don't know whether I'd be so sensitive to it. I don't know. There's no way of knowing. But I would recommend to stay in touch with your work in as many ways as you can. Certainly you can do extremely sensitive things with your hands, but the computer's an instrument also that you can do very sensitive things with, to even maybe more sensitive in some ways and less sensitive in other ways. But I think it's almost like a dance, you know? I mean, you don't want to get too mechanical, and you might get too mechanical more easily by not having that beautiful tactile, you know, experience. So it's an ongoing, I mean, to make the question, make an easy answer, it all depends on the results. You know, if you can get the very sensitive results through the computer, do it. And I think you can find a lot of analogies about that, like that in music. I mean, there was a lot of, I know that jazz, they didn't want to have anything to do with electric stuff, and now you got some pretty beautiful stuff happening. So, anyway.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
About the iconography, have you ever had an instance where you kind of proposed a major use of icons, but then found, you know, a limitation to what they could do in that particular instance?
No, not really. I don't think that was any reason that I remember of not, you know, of developing and then not using. Usually it's more political. I mean, either, you know, like I've done things where a whole collapse of a financial system or something, you know, I mean, but you can't, I mean, you just got to deal with that type of stuff. But as far as the a system not working, no, I don't think I've ever, I mean, of course it could happen. I hope it doesn't.
From all the places that you've been and all the people that you've worked with, which it's quite a great experience and a rich experience, and you've learned so many things from working with them and interacting with them because they're familiar coaches as well. Is there one thing that you would consider the most important that you've learned from those people that you put into your work? And is there just one thing that you've learned so far which would greatly influence and be of great help to anyone who wants to follow the same steps?
Yeah, I think in a, you know, in a grandiose way, I mean, you can't beat working on the Olympics and working in a place like Mexico. That was wonderful, but I might not have been so open and sensitive to being able to do what I did there if I didn't go to Yugoslavia first. In Zagreb, I mean, I kind of grew up in the States, and I was in New York, I was in Detroit, I was in my little hometown of, you know, an industrial town. So I was pretty kind of shut in a little bit as far as what I understood and what, you know, how I dealt with things. And when I wound up in Zagreb, they were still behind the curtain, and I met Tito, Marshal Tito, you know, and they didn't have hardly anything to work with, and they were so clever with black and white. They didn't have color photography. I did something there that I wish I had recorded, but it was the first time that I was in another culture that was really a different culture, and I realized that you could do things a lot of different ways, and they were good. You know, it didn't have to all be how you thought things were done, only one way, and this is the only good way. I mean, I learned that. So when I went to Mexico, I was very flexible from that experience. But I did something there. We had a lot of the panels, and I remember the typography was kind of a forerunner of Helvetica. I think it was Standard, was the name of the typography. And I did all the text with that typography. We had blocks of text. And I remember I was there for 3 months. We had to build a lot of it in Zagreb. And I came out the first day to work with everybody. And they had these big panels of typography. They were hand painting. And I had brought over film to, you know, make contact silk screens. And I said, don't you guys have silk screens? And they said, no. So I said, are you going to paint all of this? Yes. And I said, we're going to be open in time? Well, we're going to work day and night. I mean, yeah, but they were actually planning to work day and night. So I said, well, that's not great. So I said, what would you do normally? And the guy took a brush and he did the most beautiful script, you know, I mean, it's beautiful. And so I thought, wow, let's do the text like that. So I went and I told our manager, the American manager, the director of the whole thing, I said, I don't think we're going to be able to get open unless we could do it with their script. So I said, oh, go ahead. But the whole show was in Zagreb. It was all American products. It was constructive use of leisure time. I mean, they had go-karts. We had all kinds of things. But it was a sense of place that typography created. And when I look back at that, that was my first experience of doing something someplace. And it was, I mean, you don't want to, it was nice that it looked like it was in Zagreb. It wasn't like the States coming in and saying, do this, and this is great and everything. It just looked like an integrated experience. So that was a big experience for me. I wish I was sensitive enough to photograph it, because I don't have anything on that. But Mexico I do, so I learned. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just from what you were saying throughout, was a lot of the instances was about people that you met, and as part of like the development of where you got to. Was that integral in, like, obviously I'm not working in the industry, I'm not at uni anymore. How do you land the job at Mexico 68?
How what?
How do you land the job at Mexico 68?
Oh, how did I land it?
Yeah. Like, is it a process of people that you met that landed that, or was it?
Well, I met the Mexican architect in New York. I'll elaborate on that. Mexico was the first country that brought the Olympics to Latin America, right? So that was a big accomplishment. And it was done by an ex-president, Lopez Mateos. And after he got the whole thing started and he became the head of the Olympic Committee, he got sick. He got really sick. He went into a coma. And the architect of the World's Fair Pavilion in New York, where I was working, went back to Mexico. His assistant came and worked in the office I was working in. The other guy went back to Mexico and he designed the Museum of Anthropology. His name is Ramirez Vasquez. And then when Lopez Mateos, the ex-president, died, or well, he did die eventually, but when he got very sick, they asked Ramirez Vasquez to come and take over the chairmanship of the Olympic Committee. Okay, they decided, well, they didn't have graphic design in Mexico at that point. We were just getting it in New York, I mentioned, And they decided they were going to have a competition. They were going to go around and ask offices to submit proposals. And they were going to ask individual designers to come down for a 2-week period. I had met the architect in New York. We got on the list to go down for the 2-week period. Almost didn't make it, but at the end of that 2 weeks, I designed the Mexico 68, and it won. So, yeah. I mean, that was it. That was as simple and as crazy as it was. And thank goodness we won, because we had one-way tickets, I told you that, right?
Any other questions? Yes.
I was interested in how much testing or types of testing you do around your wayfinding and your iconography or your mapping. Do you actually sometimes just put stuff up and how about testing?
No, let's see. It varies. I mean, I try to avoid. One thing I do, especially working with cities or working with institutions, if you work with an institution, I always go and talk to the volunteers and I talk to the security, because they know what's going on. So, you get a kind of a preamble to avoid testing, because you're usually right on with a lot of things. I want to hear a story? Are any of you aware of Tomoko Miho? Tomoko is a really fine designer. And Tomoko and I were doing, she's Japanese, and Japanese-American, and we were doing Penn Station in New York. And the way we tested that is we did all of the signs. We were doing the signs. And we go down and we put full-size signs made of paper usually, in full color and everything, up in the areas, and test that way. And we put a sign up, it was on the way out, coming from the trains and going out to 7th Avenue. And this is a multi-level environment. We put a sign up, And it was a sign that was telling you go straight ahead to 7th Avenue. We had it up there, and Tomoko is very, proper, and we had the contractor putting it up, and I'm standing there, and one of the big New York cop comes up and he says, "Who's the fucking idiot that's doing that?" And I tell you this, Tomoko was very proper because I was going to point to her, but I didn't have the heart to do that because I was really the responsible one on that one. But I went over to him, I said, "Excuse me, officer, but you don't like our sign?" He said, "No." And he said, the arrow before was pointing up, and he said, it's supposed to be, it's very difficult to do a straight ahead arrow. I don't think anyone's ever done a real one. And he said that everyone was going up to the taxi area instead of going out to 7th Avenue. He said, now you got the goddamn arrow pointing down. Now they're going to go down the subway and come back up and give me a hard time, so, right? So I said, what would you do? He said, just right straight ahead on it. So he designed that sign. And I wrote an article, it was in a Chinese magazine actually, and I wrote that story, and I said, if you happen to be visiting New York and you see that sign and you can't read English, I said, there's a very friendly officer there that he can tell you how to get out. But we test for many, many different things. But that's one way of putting full-size signs up. It's a good idea to test. I wouldn't want to. I think the process is better to avoid testing and to do it as incrementally as you can, because you don't want to be developing something to a full range and then have someone say it doesn't work or they don't like it. Usually it's not a question of not working. It's, we're in a pretty subjective field, so it's better to deal with those kind of subjective things that might not be what you want early on, little by little, not one big kind of shot.
Oh, we've got one down front.
I recall that when the 2012 London Olympic ident was released, a lot of controversy was around it because
Yeah.
people thought it was too stringent and didn't really reflect London and the rest of the UK. So I wondered firstly what you thought of the 2012 branding of the Olympics. And secondly, with the exception of the Mexican 68 campaign, which Olympic design was your favourite, apart from your own?
Apart from the 68? Okay, one at a time. When the London Games were first, given a logo, I had no idea all the flack it caught here, but Creative Review magazine asked me over the web what I thought of it, and I looked at it and I said, it's interesting. It's not the same approach that we took, but it's really a container. And this was like 6 years before the Olympics. I think it was done 2 years. It was a long time before the Olympics. I said, when the Olympics actually happen, who knows what, contemporary is going to be contemporary. And so I still think that, but I think something else was at work there. I think, the Olympics themselves have changed, and they become very commercial, and I've done a little homework into this myself, because I started catching flack. What do you mean? I said, give it a chance. That was what I told Creative Review, and that got up on the web, and I said, give it a chance. So I had to kind of think about it. Well, did I really mean that? Yeah, I did. And I think, to use that, you had to spend a lot of money. So it was pretty prohibitive. In Mexico, everybody was using everything. I mean, the students were making protest things. People were painting the logo on the front of their shops and everything. There wasn't that restriction. And, the Olympics were a short period of time, but the whole city was like part of it, In London, I don't think that really ever got out. And it got some pretty heavy-duty criticism. There were some pretty clever crits put on it, so it had a hard time doing anything. But I think it would have worked if it had a better chance to be used. And it was a container, and I think it could have had a lot of relevance to it. So, that was my take on it then, and it's still my take on it. And I think the Olympics themselves have become a very different type of experience. I think maybe Atlanta was the first one where they started really becoming very commercial with Coca-Cola and so forth. And then I think now they're like Cirque du Soleil. I mean, you have this opening ceremony. It has nothing to do with sports usually. Then the closing ceremony. What happened, So I know I'm a bit of a purist as far as the Olympics are concerned. We had I think, a very beautiful Olympic Games in Mexico. It had a lot of wholesomeness as far as the human spirit was concerned. Now, as far as other games, I like some of the things they did in Beijing. We were over in Beijing and met the designers, and I like that they went into some of the early Chinese forms for their sporting icons. So they actually did pretty well with it, but they had a big Cirque du Soleil certainly for yeah. So there you go. I mean, it's not easy to pinpoint because I think the programs themselves have become quite fragmented. We had, I mentioned the chairman was an architect, so for me, I had a guy that I could show design to who understood design, so it was either go with it or don't go with it, but it was usually a very educated and a very sensitive working relationship in that sense. And I think that's kind of broken down. We're not an easy profession because, it's like computers happen, everyone's a designer, So you really got to get to the point where it's a collaborative effort, I think Barcelona, I like the character. I guess I'm a sense of place guy. I like to see something that represents not just the Olympics and everything that goes into the games themselves, but where the Olympics take place. And I think that's going to become more important. I think we were the first ones that really kind of did that intentionally. And I like to see that become more important, a sense of place. That's why I like to do urban programs. Okay.
Any others? Just one quick. Oh, yes, Jack.
Hi. If you could give one piece of advice to students or graduates to try and become a great designer like yourself, get to a position where you are now, what would it be?
Just show up. And I mean that by kind of just be aware of what you're dealing with. Because I think design really, in its essence, design and art, it starts out as being two different things. I mean, design usually is a sense of you have to solve problems. And if you're in graphic design, it's usually communication problems. In art, you don't have to do that. But I think in order to solve problems, you got to understand what the problem is. So I think just being alert, and like I mentioned before, do what you like doing, if you possibly can do that. And don't take anything else. Yeah?
Okay, my final question.
Oh, let me just add to that. I'll add to that a little bit. Don't have attitude. That's another part of just show up, Really see what you're dealing with. Don't think you know what you're dealing with in any way at all. Just kind of, see it and understand it the best you can. That's all you can really do. Then the design kind of deals with problem solving in a much more pure way. So that's what I try to do anyway.
Okay, this is the most important question. As someone who actually saw Pele in his prime, who's better, Pele or Messi?
Oh my God. That's so hard. Messi is so, he's kind of special because he's not a normal kind of guy, he's like a Martian or something, Oh, I don't know. They're both so beautiful, and they played a bit of a different game. My fellow that I work with down in Mexico is from Argentina, so he would probably say Messi. But we had Cosmos seasons tickets when Pele finally came up. He and Carlos Alberto played for the Cosmos, so we saw them at the end of their career. But he was just so special. You know, he stood in the center of the pitch, and he was standing there talking to some guy, and he kicked the ball up. It went up about, 50 feet, and he'd stand there and go straight up again, then go straight up again. Then he hit it up with his head. The damn ball just kept going straight up and straight up and straight up. And, he was just amazing, We saw him taking a tennis lesson in New York, though, and he was bad. So, so.
Okay, if that's the end of the questions, another round of applause, please.
Thank you.